Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second webinar in our COVID-19 series, Supply Management Response to the Pandemic. I'm Nicole Leonardi, Director of Corporate Accounts with CAPS Research. Joining me today and leading the webinar is Geoff Zwemke, CAPS Director of Benchmarking. Today's webinar will be primarily supply management focused and will include data and information from CAPS survey results released on March 20th and May 1st, as well as information learned during our industry-specific pandemic conference calls held with companies like yours in the month of April. Because there are so many new attendees to today's webinar, I want to tell you a little about our organization. CAPS Research is a recognized supply management research center in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. We focus on advancing the profession of supply management, and we do this by providing our corporate members with access to timely benchmarking and best practice information, thought-provoking and strategic research, and through events that allow you to connect with your peers. Before we begin, I just want to highlight an additional resource that we have available. Historically, all of our current content has only been available to employees of corporate member companies. Because of the importance of today's topic and our belief that we can assist companies during this difficult time, we have opened all of our coronavirus content to the public. We have created a coronavirus resource page on our website that includes links to both of our recent reports, a recording of our previous webinar, infographics, and other relevant reports. All of this, as I mentioned, is available to the public. To access the reports, you will need to create a free CAPS library account. Now, let me turn it over to Geoff to begin today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. We know we have some folks spread around different time zones, so glad that you could join us. As Nicole said, I am the Director of Benchmarking at CAPS Research, and what that means is our team is really leveraging our network of companies to gain insights on supply management programs, practices, tools, plus KPIs. And as Nicole mentioned, that's all focused around the supply management function and activity. Much of what we are doing is informed by people like yourself, so that we are making sure that the topics that we are collecting information on are relevant and timely. So let's jump in. So as Nicole mentioned, this content that we're sharing with you today really was us going to our network of global companies, and we collected content and data from 2 surveys and multiple industry calls that we arranged so that the calls were by industry with several companies on each call and leaders in supply management, talking specifically about the challenges and actions that they're taking during the pandemic. So most of what you're going to hear today is from those 3 sources, but especially our most recent survey, which we published at the head of this month. And you can see here just a little bit of an overview of the survey respondents. It was 115, mostly global companies, with total revenue, annual revenue of all the companies is just over $2 trillion, so quite a big representation, at least as far as global supply management groups go. And the breakout by sector, and the way at CAPS Research we like to look at the broader sectors as distinguished from industries, are 40% of them were manufacturing, 40% process, and 20% services. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those mean when we provide our first breakout look at the data by those 3. All righty, so greatest challenge facing supply management during the pandemic. We asked companies to tell us and force them to select only one option so that we could get an idea of what really is it that's floating to the top for most of the supply management professionals. So the top 4 that we saw were increased demand for PPE, so that's face masks and ventilators, anything around personal health and safety, decreased source of supply from hot zones, increased lead time, and then shortage of logistics carriers. So I'm actually going to show you the results from our first survey, the March 20th results, and you can see this is percent of companies, and we had about the same number of companies, around 100, that participated in the March 20th, the survey that the results released on March 20th. So you can see about a third of the companies said the greatest challenge was increased demand for PPE, 20% for the decreased source of supply from hot zones and increased lead time, and then about 12% for a shortage of logistics carriers. So what did the May 1st results show, and then what was the change? Increased demand for PPE went up 40%, went up to 40% of companies, or 9% increase in companies saying this is their single greatest challenge. We see that decreased source of supply from hot zones dropped just a couple percentage points in terms of companies selecting that as their greatest challenge. Increased lead time dropping about 5%, and then shortage of logistics carriers dropping by about 9%. So not a surprise that we see an increase in the fact that demand for PPE is the greatest challenge. We know that probably early on, a lot of folks went through their current inventory and starting to realize, I think for all of us, this unfolded in waves and becoming increased awareness that we're in this for the long run, and probably getting a better idea of what is needed out there, especially as more recs came in from different parts of the business for PPE, and especially for those where folks have people that are out in the field, in the plants, in factory, essential services that couldn't shut down. We also weren't necessarily surprised to see a decrease in those selecting increased lead time as their greatest challenge. We think that over time, and what we're hearing, companies are working out their material flows, gaining more visibility into their sub-tiers, having time to shift to alternate sources, and we'll see some of that as a result. A little surprised to see the decrease, honestly, in the logistics, as shortage of logistics carriers as the greatest challenge. But we think probably as we've talked through this and hearing from other companies that, initial talk with the travel bans, if you recall those, it seems like a long time ago, travel bans related to China and Europe. There was a lot of anticipation, perhaps, of logistics challenges, but we know there has been improvement in shipping availability and options over time as we've dug into this a little bit more. Airlines, for example, starting to convert some passenger planes to cargo. So for some of you still struggling with shortage of logistics carriers, that might be a way to look at. And then also, we have seen actually some data that shows inbound and outbound truck movement is up in general across the U.S. from an organization called Four Kites. It hit its floor, the lowest point, the week of April 27th. So right about the time our survey was wrapping up. Also, Supply Chain Drive said that they believe the easing of restrictions that we're starting to see by states have also helped increase load trends. So actually, we're here physically in Arizona. Truck movement in AZ jumped up more than 24% compared to its 2-week average. The outbound, the biggest jump was in Alabama, and that went up by 15%. And coincidentally, or not, Arizona's stay-at-home order expired last Friday, and Alabama's on April 30th. So might be seeing that is becoming less of a challenge for supply chain management folks. So just want to mention a few things that you may be able to relate to that also are challenges that companies have told us they're facing. One that we've heard on the calls is concern around how accurate and reliable the information is that's coming in, whether it's from suppliers, whether it's from customers. It's just a constant shifting landscape, although we're getting a little bit of a feel that maybe that's starting to settle down. Visibility into the supply base, inaccurate customer forecasts, understandably. Supplier production volume variability is a challenge. And then just some suppliers closing down for several weeks and having buying companies scramble to find new sources, or a lot of them leaning in to actually engage and help get those suppliers back up on their feet. And then supplier financial health and the risk that's associated with companies struggling financially and potentially closing their doors, having to stop production, is something that's got a lot of companies looking at also. But we're also seeing the buying companies stepping up to help those suppliers through some of those pinch points, making sure that suppliers can meet the supply demand. They're assisting with changing some of their payables, et cetera. So, all righty. So I'm going to show a breakout now by sector of the three sectors that CAPS has identified, most of it based on feedback from companies like those on this call, from our members. So we'll show some of these challenges by sector. So throughout this deck, the manufacturing sector, you can see some of the industries there that we put in: aerospace and defense, automotive and transport manufacturing, skipping down to industrial manufacturing, et cetera. Then for process, and this is the one that sometimes folks have the biggest question on, this is companies like engineering and construction, chemical processing, diversified food and beverage, metals and mining, oil and gas or petroleum, pharma and utilities. So they may not be producing or manufacturing a discrete product, but taking in raw materials and then doing something to them, a process that they go through for some other outcome. But they're not services companies in the sense that they are investing still in a lot of equipment from a capital perspective. And then more of the pure services organizations that are really providing an intangible service. So these groupings are based on feedback from our companies, but for members, we can always divide up and give you a view of your data compared to whatever grouping of industries that you would like to see for comparison. So also, not all these industries participated in the survey. All right, enough on the sector explanation. So what did we see with increased demand for PPE, decreased source of supply from the hot zones, increased lead time, and then a new one that you didn't see on the previous slide: difficulty conducting strategic activity while the companies are in crisis mode. So we didn't ask that on the first survey, so we weren't able to show you trending, but did include it in the second survey because we know that's something that we were picking up and hearing. So it was actually the fourth greatest challenge that we heard on the May report. So there you can see manufacturing on the first column. Their greatest challenge is decreased source of supply from hot zones. We think manufacturing is still challenged finding the raw materials and components that they need and purchasing perhaps more of those than most process and certainly most services companies. You can see then the process companies at 52% for increased demand for PPE, and notably higher than the other sectors. Looking deeper into the data and seeing which, we saw several utilities companies, oil and gas companies that contributed or responded to the survey. And pretty much across the board, most of those companies said that increased demand for PPE was the highest for them. Some of these, especially utilities companies, may source fewer goods and materials from outside the U.S., so things like sourcing from hot zones and logistics challenges may have been less relevant to them. But we know from our phone calls that these process companies, a lot of the industries, are still very actively engaged in projects. They have a strong workforce, a lot of contract workers, so they have a high need, perhaps higher than the other industries, for PPE to ensure that their workers and contractors are coming to work out in the field, in the plants, on site, and many of these, of course, not allowed to close their doors or cease their operations. So All right, services a little lower in PPE as the greatest challenge, perhaps fewer in the field workers, many of them, since they're delivering intangible services, more knowledge-based work, and perhaps allowing for more folks working from home. All right, so that's the greatest challenges facing supply management, the view by sector. All right, so what are some of the actions then as a result of these challenges that the supply management group is taking? And I'll show you a couple slides here of all the action, and part of the reason we're sharing all of these and not just the top ones, in case these are things that you can be doing at your organization as well. So of course, just an increased or high level of sourcing PPE. We're going to break that down a little bit later to talk about some specific activity around that. Companies are increasing the monitoring that they're doing for supplier financial risk, as I mentioned earlier. We're also seeing high activity around assessing their supply chain sub-tiers, so beyond the first tier supplier, into those deeper levels to identify where there are vulnerabilities and risk to assurance of supply or other risks. And then companies are shifting to alternate sources. All right, so in the March 20th report, you can see that and companies could select more than one activity. This wasn't a forced select only one. But assessing supply chain sub-tiers to identify vulnerabilities came out 75% of the companies saying that was, or most companies conducting that activity, following pretty closely behind by the shift to alternate sources and high level of sourcing for PPE. But then the May 1st report, so several weeks later, saw an increase in the high level of sourcing for PPE, which we discussed a little bit already, why that might be the case. We did not ask the increased monitoring of supplier financial risk on the March 20th report, but the May 1st, it's 63% of companies saying that they're increasing their monitoring. So we know supplier financial risk is always a concern, but then of course when the economy is vulnerable, and in the case of the pandemic, it's for especially small businesses, buying companies are wanting to get more visibility into how their suppliers are doing and their financial health. So not surprised to see that at 63% of the companies. And then you can see that there was a drop in the last two between the surveys, where 17% and 12% fewer companies were assessing supply chain sub-tiers and also shifting to alternate sources. So we think that, and what we're hearing from companies is that initial activity in the earlier days, it was more in crisis mode. And it feels like we've gotten past, for a lot of companies, the initial blindside and some of the urgency of finding out who and which suppliers and the sub-tier were vulnerable. And then alternately, once you find out who is, that shift to an alternate source. So some of that behavior, some of that action, I should say, is starting to reside, but 58% and 56%, about half of the companies still doing that, is still a noticeable number. We also think that the decline in the shift to alternate sources, a lot of that had to do moving out of Asia, China, European countries that were hit the hardest. That was more of a concern on the front end. We know that it's still there. Folks reconsidering onshoring and looking for less vulnerable regions, and that seems to be settling in a little bit more, perhaps week by week. And then also we think there's a shift to the change in strategy for some to be more multi-source, considering that. They're talking about that to be, to be less multi-source and switching to more single source, just to increase flexibility and resiliency, a word we're hearing a lot during this time. But then just as an aside or an interesting note, before the pandemic, assessing sub-tiers was an activity that we have a data point on that there were 39% of companies said yes in that particular survey that they are mapping beyond a tier 1. So it's still, even with the 17% decline in companies assessing their sub-tiers, 58% is still historically high. All right, other challenges, other actions that supply management is taking. And again, we're sharing these on the webinar. We want you to have an idea for you to compare with your company where you fit in, and then also if some of these are activities that ought to be floating to the top of what you're looking at as you move from perhaps a little bit out of the crisis mode into more strategic and more proactive. All right, managing increased force majeure notices, responding to increased logistics challenges, increasing the material inventory, improving demand planning and S&OP integration, and renegotiating contracts due to volume change. So these were additional actions that companies were taking. And you can see the percent of companies there, what it looked like with the March 20th report. The managing increased force majeure notices was barely a blip on the radar screen early on. And then as we began to hear more companies mentioning that they were seeing warnings or actual notices come in, we added it to the second survey. But at that time, you can see the response to increased logistics challenges was in this particular slide, one of the actions that most companies were taking. So let's look at the change then from then to the more recent survey. 52% of about half of companies are proactively managing their force majeure notices. And the way we asked the question on the survey was that it's a coordinated activity or process to manage these, not necessarily a one-off, but also hearing on phone calls that there are some of the supply management groups and some of the companies are creating a central hub to receive all the force majeure warnings or notices, tracking those. Some of them have a dashboard, and they're making sure that everybody in the organization knows that it rolls up to one central group, because we know that suppliers might submit it to legal, they might submit it to the business, they might submit it to supply management. So some companies have struggled with wrapping their arms around what is the force majeure notice landscape look like. So that's what some of the other companies are doing. So then we saw a 22% drop in the needing to respond to the increased logistics challenges, and shared already some of the reasons why. 11% fewer companies that are increasing their material inventory. And then an uptick, 9% added companies improving demand planning and their S&OP integration, and then an increase in companies renegotiating their contracts due to volume changes that the suppliers are telling them about. So really this to us looks like, and what we're hearing again from the companies that we speak to, it's a movement away from crisis response, more to an increase in strategic activity. So people are seeing opportunities in supply management to build and strengthen relationships and trust with suppliers, and hearing some really great stories that, as suppliers are stepping up to really respond, and that it's been impressive, and their level of wanting to collaborate, wanting to help, exploration of capabilities. We know too that companies are also responding around shortening their payment terms to help support those suppliers. But then also we hear some are extending those too, given their own financial situation. All right, and so as with the increase in demand planning, We know that given some of the challenges of finding accurate information, that this is probably why this one's has increased. The needing to get better information, needing to get more engaged supply management with the demand planning if they weren't before, and understanding what customers are asking for, but especially in a shifting landscape. And then just the note on a short note on the fewer companies increasing their material inventory. Again, probably a shift away from crisis mode or reaction mode, and reevaluation perhaps on the impact of cash flow and working capital with the increase in inventory. All right, let's take a look now at the sector breakout. So for manufacturing, assessing their supply chain sub-tiers came out as the top action that they're taking, tied with the high level or increased sourcing for PPE. We're not surprised to see this, the assessing the supply chain sub-tiers up there at the top. Many manufacturing companies we see have deeper supply chains that extend further into raw materials, components, and subcomponents, especially in certain industries. And then we look at the process, the top actions that they're taking, high level of sourcing for PPE at the top, some of the reasons we mentioned already, with increased monitoring of supplier financial risk, right up there at the second one. But still a lot of companies conducting and acting in these different ways. And then services companies, high level of sourcing for PPE coming out on top as well, and shift to alternate sources. We were a little surprised to see that as the second highest. Some of the data suggests, and some of our conversations, that the industries and services felt a little less blindsided or hit as hard, and perhaps came out of the crisis mode a little bit sooner and able to react a little bit quicker to starting to look for alternate sources. All right, let's talk a little bit more about PPE challenges. Here are the top challenges that companies are telling us specifically that they have. 21% of them are seeing internal distribution or prioritization issues, some hoarding. There's a lack of controls on who gets what PPE or who can order it. PPE orders canceled by suppliers. About a quarter of the companies said that that's happening. 38% are experiencing PPE supplies held or delayed at the port of entry. We're seeing almost half of the companies saying that inflated prices or gouging of PPE is occurring. Not surprised to see that. PPE delivery date being moved by the supplier as they adjust to increased demand, government expectations and intervention, so almost 60%. And then just a general shortage of PPE, 80% of the companies experiencing that. So no surprise, no wonder that it's one of the leading stories in companies in general, and of concern really across the board to supply management professionals. Companies could select more than one option on this when they mention what their challenges were. Only 6% of the companies said they're not experiencing challenges sourcing PPE, and then only 4% said they're not sourcing PPE at all. A few things that we've heard mentioned in our calls too, that just the challenge some companies have faced with the quality of the PPE supplies that they've received, and some of them not based on certain health codes or standards, or suppliers actually perhaps not qualified to produce or manufacture some of those. All right, let's take just a quick snapshot of the sector view. Shortage of PPE, the challenges across the board for all the different sectors. And then pretty much the same mix, more or less in the second, third, and fourth place. So you can peg yourself against the sector that makes the most sense to you and see if that makes sense. All right, so what are some of the actions supply management is taking to find PPE, and especially when everybody else is looking for it? What we saw from our survey is that 23% of the companies are using marketplace platforms for broader solicitation, so expanding the reach of their search, for example, using Amazon for Business. We have 24%, so about a quarter of the companies saying that they're actually partnering with their supplier to help that supplier pivot their manufacturing capability to produce PPE. And of course, we hear that in the news. We know that textile companies are shifting to make cloth masks. We know industrial manufacturers, examples of those that are building ventilators, creating ventilators. Services companies, especially those that strong in tech and data, are putting those services and their people at the service of getting more timely and accurate information on what's happening with the pandemic. 52% of the companies said they're creating a process to prioritize and manage the internal demand. So in response to some of those challenges that companies told us they're having with some of the hoarding. And we know that this has been as simple as companies doing this really through a crisis center or a command central, and just ranking those parts of the organization that are the top priority for getting PPE. So folks, especially out in the field, in the plants, essential services, perhaps a little less so for those coming in with administrative roles, still coming into the office. And then 70% said that they're sourcing PPE from local or diverse suppliers. So this is a pretty significant shift then for buying companies to really tap their community, their local suppliers, often smaller suppliers, to see what that supplier can do to help with PPE products, and then also from their diverse supplier base. And of course, this is good news for a lot of smaller companies, many of which local and diverse suppliers are. This is something that can help lift or prop them up to see that kind of demand in an economic downturn that can be damaging to small suppliers. All right, and then 75% of companies said they're ordering larger volumes to break down for individual use and distribution. One company we know turned to buy drums of hand sanitizer, so giant industrial-sized quantities that normally these suppliers would sell to industrial customers like restaurants, like schools, who really, of course, their demand for this has dried up. And then they would break it down into smaller containers themselves as an organization for distribution then for their own people. So interesting to see that that was the number one action that folks were taking as far as solutions to the shortage of PPE. Another 19% told us that they are limiting who is an authorized requester of PPE in the purchasing system. And of course, a lot of systems are designed that they can put restrictions on who can do that. So that's helping a little bit with the internal controls of prioritizing and getting PPE into the hands of those who need it most. And then 7% said they're also just limiting the quantity in their purchasing systems of how much PPE can be ordered. All right, so hopefully some of these might be new to you and your organization if you're experiencing a shortage in PPE solutions. And I would say if you're a company that we plan on doing another round of these calls by industry, and if that's something you're interested in, that's normally a benefit that's only reserved for member companies, but we will be doing another round. The first round, we opened it up to non-member companies, and happy to do that again on a second round. So there'll be an email at the end of this presentation if that's something that you're interested in. Would be happy to have you participate. All right, and then just a quick look at how this looks as far as sector, with the only difference on the top one being services. Companies, their primary activity is sourcing from local and diverse suppliers to find PPE in more creative ways. All right, so we're going to shift a little bit away from what the supply management group is doing in terms of their response to the pandemic, and we asked a few questions on our survey around what actions companies overall are taking. We know this is a continuing and dynamic landscape, especially personnel, how it's impacting resources, people, headcounts, lives. So we did ask companies to tell us what they were doing around these actions, or I'm sorry, we asked the supply management folks what their companies are doing. 53% in a hiring freeze, no surprise there. 28% are requiring time off and furloughing. 25%, a quarter of companies conducting layoffs, and of course we see that reflected partly in our unemployment numbers. And then 17% enacting pay cuts. Companies, just a handful here or there, mentioning that they're also cutting or deferring the 401k match, eliminating overtime, which for a lot of folks essentially represents a pay cut, releasing contract workforces, and then offering voluntary leave or retirement packages or options to their teams. It was interesting, out of the 115 companies, only 2 said that they were hiring. There may be more, but this was in the comments. 2 said they were hiring right now, and one of them said they're actually doing this, it's an intense hiring focus to fill prior vacancies. All right, so let's take a look at how this pans out by sector. The hiring freeze, we see it's higher in the process sector, but not necessarily by too much across the board. Companies that are requiring time off or furloughing, I'd say it's a little more of a significant difference there for the manufacturing sector. And we know from talking to companies that when factories and production stops, they tend to furlough and then recall manufacturing roles back in at a later time. Layoffs is more or less pretty evenly distributed through the 3 sectors. And then pay cuts, again, manufacturing, I would say out on top, noticeably more so than process and services. And we are hearing companies are cutting salaries, manufacturers cutting salaried and admin roles. Tesla, for example, mentioned that they're cutting 10% and 30% salaried employees and then furloughing their manufacturing roles. Rockwell Automation, their chairman and CEO is taking a 25% salary reduction, all SVPs taking a 15% cut, and all other non-manufacturing employees worldwide taking a 7.5% cut. All right. Companies supporting their community. So we asked what the supply management professionals, what their own companies were doing to help support and solve the problem of the pandemic. And the top activity was providing financial donations to health, community, research organizations. And you think about the fact that of the companies in our survey, if 71% of those are doing that, and they represent, all the companies represent over $2 trillion in revenue, let's hope that that's something that could really move the needle for communities in need. Donating PPE, pivoting their own manufacturing capability to produce PPE, and then hosting food drives, hosting blood drives. So there you can see the percentages. 71% of companies, I said, are providing those financial donations. Some of them specifically told us that their donations are going specifically to accelerate medical research to find a vaccine for COVID-19. Some companies also told us that they're assisting their nonprofit customers and helping them to shift to virtual fundraising. Lots of the donations, some companies are donating tests actually to hospitals. They're paying for testing. One company said they're increasing their employees' charitable giving match. Another company said that they're doing everything they can. This was a sizable company with a big supply base to pay and release work to small businesses in as expedited a manner when possible. Let's see, what else do we have companies doing here? This is the good news, right? Some of the highlights of corporate, mostly American companies from the survey stepping up. And then just to brag a little bit on our organization at Arizona State University, there's currently 200 dedicated teams from different disciplines working directly in research in the fight against COVID. And one example of that is a professor who built a lab at his home to create systems for ozone reconditioning of N95 masks and other surgical gear. I'm not sure exactly what that exactly means, but we're glad to see ASU supporting and doing its part. So probably a lot of these your company can relate to, and of course it's important to make sure that our organizations are giving back to the community. So let's just shift now to a little bit of looking at post-pandemic. We asked companies specifically, and they could choose only one of 4 options, what their level of post-pandemic planning is. So the first level was 9% of the companies said they have not moved beyond crisis response to begin their planning activity. 44%, and the highest number, said that they're in the initial planning stages of looking at post-pandemic activity. 37%, the next highest level, said they already have robust planning in place. And then 10% of all the companies said that they are executing already on post-pandemic planning. Let's look and see how that slices out by sector. So the first level have not, you can see the breakout in terms of have not moved beyond crisis response. In initial planning stages, pretty even across the board. Robust planning in place. And then here where we see a little more variation, executing on post-pandemic plans, almost double the companies as a percentage in the services sector over manufacturing and process. So we were curious why that would be, and looking back at the notes from many of our calls, and specifically with financial services, which is probably the largest represented services industry in the services sector, many of them expressed, as I mentioned earlier, feeling a little less the impact initially from some of the blindside stuff that came out of nowhere, and we're able to shift a little bit quicker from crisis mode and focus more and more quickly on planning and moving forward and looking beyond the pandemic. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what does post-pandemic planning look like, and I'm going to present that to you in 2 ways. First, some considerations at a broad level. Let's take a step back and look at, here's what we're hearing the new normal may look like. on the long term, on the bigger picture, and of course, this could have an impact on what companies, what supply management groups are doing once they move past the pandemic. So will we see more nationalism and more reshoring, more building and buying domestically? As we all know, before the pandemic, we already saw protectionism, nationalism through just a couple examples, Trump's trade war, Brexit, makes one wonder what will it be like after the pandemic. Probably we expect to see decreased global trade and cooperation, and with the emphasis, as I mentioned already in the first point, of building and buying domestically, seeing now in the legislature right now in the U.S. tax incentives for reshoring and selecting suppliers domestically instead of over shores. Will we see a massive shift to remote? What will universities be doing? What will doctors' offices be doing? You know, many of us were introduced to telemedicine for the first time during the pandemic, and talking to a doctor over a screen instead of going into the office. You know, one example in terms of universities, the one I know the best, ASU, in March, they shifted 70,000 students to remote learning in only a few weeks. And just last week, 17,000 of those graduated remotely. Now, ASU has plans to reopen physically in the fall, but what kind of shift are we going to see in our society, perhaps less in person and more remote? Unfortunately, there are groups with malicious intent that are watching and learning from the pandemic and perhaps adopting new modes of operation. And will we see increased biological warfare? Will they take advantage of more remote, so to speak, attacks? And will we see an increase in cyber attacks? We know that's already one of the leading concerns for companies, and some of our research showing that from a few years ago that around half of cyber breaches originating from the supply base. So this is a concern really not only just for the company, but also supply management. And then just an increase in IP espionage, intellectual property. Are we going to see more laws? So if there's going to be more nationalism, more reshoring, will there be more laws that are around trade, dictating how to trade, who to trade with? We already see that in some heavily regulated industries like aerospace and defense. Will that spill into others? Will we see an increase in laws around environmental protection? We know that many people have noticed the air is a lot cleaner and there are a lot fewer people on the road during the pandemic. Will there be legislation, expectations that could become even more strict or a little more difficult for companies to work with in terms of environmental? And then what about personal health laws? Will it be mandatory to wear face masks in public, during travel, in offices, especially until a vaccine has been proven effective and has worldwide distribution? Will it be mandatory or incentivized to have a vaccine in order to work? And then a significant decline for some industries and business models. What's the future hold for industries like commercial real estate if there is a significant shift to remote, to travel, to hotel, restaurants, retail? So all things that we know from our own personal experience. So these are some questions that we're hearing being asked, that we're asking at CAPS around what is post-pandemic, or what does the new normal look like? These things probably need to be on the radar screen, at least for supply management, in asking its own questions around post-pandemic planning. So I'm going to narrow it in now a little bit more specifically to supply management. Some of the shorter term questions that can be asked, and even despite the crisis, we're encouraging folks, and we're seeing, of course, companies as soon as possible shifting back to priorities that they had in place before the pandemic. And some of these priorities may be even more urgent now, given the new business landscape. But supply management, many folks are asking, and we're encouraging more companies to ask, should we be shortening, replacing, unwinding our supply chains based potentially on the new normal of nationalism? Should we be sourcing and building in our own country in more stable regions? Is it worth perhaps the increased cost that some of these activities might make for a longer term ROI and protection against risk? Do supply management groups look at their supply base mix and change that up? And their sourcing strategies? Should they avoid single source suppliers, again, potentially at a higher cost, but to help increase the resiliency of their supply base and reduce risk protection? Should companies and should supply management be increasing their efforts to deliver stakeholder value and make sure that they're embedded in the business? We think that this could present opportunities to advance supply management, not just incrementally, but significantly for some companies. Of course, a lot of this depends on where your organization may be on its transformation journey, but it might be an opportunity to take larger strides that might have been more difficult to do earlier on and pre-pandemic. Should supply management be increasing its priority to invest in digitization of the function of the supply chain? We know there was a high amount of activity for supply management and, of course, more broadly, the enterprise around an investment in emerging technology, around RPA, around cognitive supply, especially in data analytics. So as difficult as it may be right now for companies to look at, think of the advantages of having greater visibility with the use of improved and enhanced data analytics, and even potentially cognitive analytics to help manage risk. Should supply management be identifying the new normal for supplier collaboration and development? We've been encouraged to hear some of the stories of increased trust that has grown through this crisis between the buying company and suppliers. And we know that sometimes, and in many cases, a crisis brings out the best in us individually, and it can also for companies and their relationships for suppliers. So where is the opportunity lie for supply management then to really lean into and partner with their critical and their key suppliers, and especially those they've probably already partnered or perhaps partnered with, small business, diverse suppliers that are helping them find PPE, manufacturing suppliers that have pivoted their capabilities to PPE. Are there opportunities to develop commercial partnerships with these suppliers? A few more questions. What about hiring and reskilling talent where the shortages pre-pandemic existed, and especially in analytics? Some of our own research internally showed a shift towards gig projects where more and more companies and employees and workers are looking to do gig work. So gig in the sense of a dedicated project, maybe doing that for multiple companies. We've started to hear about unretirement projects for the first time and luring folks that are close to retirement back into jobs and tasks and projects specifically designed for them. And with what's happened to a lot of folks with their 401ks, perhaps there's an opportunity there. What about looking at when and how to return to the office? This is a conversation that we've heard among many companies, but just they're asking too, what will the impact be on public transit? Will schools and daycares be opening or not during that timing? What does it mean for reconfiguration of office space? Will there be maintaining some permanent work from home for some or all employees? Is this an opportunity for supply managers to really look at their commercial real estate holdings, their configurations there? How manage and lead remote workers? How measure productivity? We know from the survey, 18% of companies said they're implementing productivity metrics for the remote workers. So we're going to go ahead and put a short poll up. That's the material that I have, and we just want to, as Nicole is pulling that poll up, just want to say that wherever your supply management group may be on its transformation journey, from tactical to strategic to adding value to businesses, just want to encourage you to think about how will the business and key stakeholders see supply management when we emerge from this crisis, and to look at opportunities, as difficult as it may be in crisis mode, to move exponentially, potentially in even one key strategic area. And of course, myself and the benchmarking team and all the CAPS are here to do whatever we can to help you in that endeavor. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole, and she will help you through the poll and wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Geoff. We appreciate all your time today. You guys do see the poll that's up on the screen, so if you do have an opportunity, this is the same questions we asked in the survey, and we're just curious to see if the data looks a little bit different than it did when we closed the survey a couple weeks ago. We're hoping to see a little bit more movement towards robust planning or execution on post-pandemic planning. So you see on your screen here that it looks like about half are in the initial planning stages. It's really nice to see that we don't have anybody that hasn't moved beyond the crisis mode right now. And at about 15% already executing on the post-pandemic plan. It's a little bit, it's kind of staying on trend for what we saw before, but moving a little bit more in the direction that we'd like to see, in a positive direction. So that does make us pretty happy to see that. If you have any additional questions after today's webinar, you can send those directly to Geoff and his team at metrics@capsresearch.org. If you have any questions on CAPS membership or what's available to our corporate members, you're able to email me directly at nleonardi@capsresearch.org. And we also have a membership page on our website that'll give you a little bit more information about the membership benefits available at capsresearch.org/membership. We appreciate everyone joining us today, and we hope everyone stays healthy and does well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.